All right, we're back today with our third live stream, and it's been such an exciting journey so far doing this. I'm Diksha,
And I'm Sophia.
and this is the AI show where we cover AI for builders and practitioners across Asia and Europe. So, welcome to the show.
And yeah, welcome. I'm excited to be here. Thank you, Dee, for doing this together. It's an amazing journey for the past few weeks with the AI show. And this week, the team basically handed itself to us because every big story is about the same thing: who ends up owning what in AI? The government wants to own a piece of OpenAI, and Meta wants to rent out the data centers it overbuilt, and one venture firm is sitting on a $14 billion gain that exists entirely on paper.
Yeah, we're going to cover all of that, and it's super interesting. Plus, we have a really good thesis, that kind of went around this week, arguing that everyone's reading the open source numbers backwards. I mean, we all know how much there's a debate in terms of like people really leaning towards more open source models, and there's like a huge narrative and a wave in Asia and even in the US after there were a lot of like these models like DeepSeek, etc., have kind of like performed really well. And also with everything that kind of is going on with Claude and in the US, there have been like a lot of this. But today we're going to go deep into like why we haven't really read all of that totally right and how it's going to impact various other angles for us to kind of adopt open source. So let's get into it.
Yeah, get us started.
Awesome. So we have the first discussion, which is super interesting, which is about how OpenAI kind of last week had Florida giving the US government a 5% equity stake, which at their recent valuation of about $852 billion kind of works out to roughly $42 billion, right? And Sam Altman's framing is that it's probably the cleanest way to share AI's upside with the public, with the Americans. And a lot of people kind of like don't agree with this because, and there was this like really interesting um, article I saw on MIT Tech Review, and they're kind of like talking about, how they're kind of sharing this equity stake with the government, wherein a lot of participants in the AI kind of really, deserve this, this kind of like incentive, so to say, because a lot of this AI is built around data from various artists or researchers or analysts, and it trains on a lot of such data. And the open question is that are we actually considering them for any kind of incentive, or it's just the government and then it's just a little funny in that way. But yeah, let's hear from you. What do you think about this whole story? Yeah.
Well, on the surface, it sounds almost generous, right? Like the public gets a slice of the winnings. But the more you sit with it, the stranger it gets. Because think about what the government's job is supposed to be here. The regulator is meant to be the referee. And the moment that referee also owns shares in one of the players, it acquires a quiet interest in that player winning. So it's getting very confusing.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Like if a government is supposed to kind of like regulate these models and these labs for the better, and obviously for the people. And there are like multiple other stories in terms of like how Chinese government doing. We'll get to that in a bit. But overall, when the regulator becomes has a stake in that business, there is this question about who's going to make decisions, how these various decisions will be impacted, and all of that. And I think that's really the tension. Plus, the same article, MIT Tech Review had recently put an article, which I was referring to. A free equity stake sounds like something that should be given to like hidden contributors, like I said. So that's a really good point. And how are we really getting to that? Is it going to be like a next step from here on, or are we considering that? Because when we talk about people's stake in AI, it really needs to mean something else, because what does it really mean for people at this point? We don't know, but I don't know, maybe it's next up in line, but it's interesting. And then antitrust kind of exists to stop any single company from getting too powerful, right? And this is what's
Yeah.
happening here. And a state that holds equity in the biggest lab has a reason to look, the other way while it does. So yeah, and this proposal kind of like goes a bit further, which is interesting because the idea kind of floated alongside where Meta imagines having Anthropic, Google, Meta, and kind of like seeding similar stakes into this one sovereign fund, that they call it. So the state would hold kind of like a basket of frontier labs and effectively root of the whole sector. So what will it really mean for the people? Will that be incentives or will that be something else? So it's interesting to watch how this is going to play out.
Yeah, and there is a downstream question to all of it. If citizens technically co-own the model through their government, do they actually get a say in what it refuses to answer?
Yeah,
It's
that
worth, yeah. It's worth remembering that this lands 2 weeks after the export control saga that we covered in episode 1. Go check it out, where the same government briefly switched the frontier model off worldwide. So within 1 month, we've seen the state act as the off switch, and now it proposes to become a shareholder. So, whatever your politics, the wall between Washington and the labs is getting thinner in both directions. And for everyone building outside the US, that's worth watching closely.
yeah, and it's going to be interesting how Asia and Europe is going to kind of like have their own regulation and kind of say and rules around some of these things. And interestingly, we have like a couple of interesting news coming in from Asia around similar concept, but it's actually, it's a little opposite. It's like working towards the people and like curbing down some of the access and some of the features, and we'll get to that later. But this is definitely interesting, like you said, for all of us to watch, and especially the builders and even enterprises. All right, so let's move on to something really big that everyone's kind of like focused on, which is
Yeah,
yeah, which is about Meta.
yeah, Meta is building a cloud business now, and it's called Meta Compute. And what it does is basically also selling its spare AI capacity. So outside developers can pay to run queries, including against Meta's own models. So that puts them head to head with Amazon Web Services, Azure, and Google Cloud.
Yeah, I think that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to like maybe get they're trying to get into this like hyperscalers race with everyone else, because I mean there are like multiple things that you could kind of infer out of this. So I think one of the important things is that you only start kind of selling your excess capacity once you've realized that you've kind of like built more than you can use. So that's definitely a question. And Meta has been one of the largest spenders in the capex
Yeah.
arms race, and I think it kind of tells us how far ahead of the actual demand probably that spending ran or overran. So that's interesting.
Yeah, given the incredible demand that there is for data center access now worldwide, Meta can actually start generating revenue quite quickly. But the seriousness is visible in the roster too, because this has Meta's head of infrastructure, a leader from Superintelligence Labs, and Meta's president all attached to it. So, I mean, companies don't staff site experiments in that way.
Definitely, I think they're super serious about it.
Yeah.
I'm just like not sure how this is all going to work and how they're going to pivot from like a totally a consumer tech company to a hyperscaler, as they call it. And it is quite a shift for us to imagine. And I'm not sure how, what goes inside the mechanics of it, or how ready they are. So it's going to be interesting to watch. And the ripple effect is the part practitioners should kind of care about, right? Once every hyperscaler and now Meta is reselling GPUs, compute starts behaving like a commodity, right? With something close to a
Yeah.
spot price, maybe. And when the thing everyone spent 2 years hoarding kind of becomes a thing anyone can rent by the hour so easily, the advantage kind of quietly moves from whoever owns the chips to whoever kind of like manages it or writes the best software around it. So, um, yeah, for builders in our part of the world who were never going to like own say a gigawatt of data center anyway, prices heading down and access opening up is genuinely good news. So I'm kind of like happy about that.
Exciting times indeed.
Definitely. All right, moving to the next big piece that we have, which is around the ECB, right? Asking
Yeah.
banks for plans to address AI cybersecurity threats, which is super interesting. And this one broke this morning, I guess, Asia time, and it's about as on brand for the show as any story can get. Europe's banking supervisor has formally told banks to prepare for the threat posed by frontier models, right? And the and letter kind of names all these players, obviously, and it specifically names Mythos, Claude's model, and yeah, I mean the ECB top supervisor wrote to the bank chief executives asking them to kind of like submit concrete action plans by the end of October, which is not yeah, which is just around the corner, right? Covering
Yeah.
faster software patching, stronger AI-enabled cyber defenses, entire oversight of third-party providers, with infrastructure modernization as a longer-term ask beyond October. So it's interesting that they have kind of like asked us banks to kind of act upon it because cybersecurity is definitely one of the points that we've been talking about around, and then that's also something we discussed last week where
Yeah.
Alex Karp kind of brought it up for all the enterprises and how they cannot give their proprietary tech or production data to frontier labs, and that's why there needs to be like something else, which obviously he says that he's building. What
Yeah.
about that?
Well, the context also makes it heavier too, because Christine Lagarde, the CEO of the bank, warned last month that AI could potentially trigger dangerous financial crisis, and told the bank CEOs that being prepared will involve serious investment. So the European Central Bank has already run 109 banks through a severe cyber attack scenario, and the European Systemic Risk Board just raised its assessment of systemic cyber risks to severe. I don't know if it's following up after unlocking again the capabilities of Fable 5, but up from elevated, which was actually the status like 3 months ago. And regulators moving a risk rating that fast is rare. Is very great and very rare, and it tells you how quickly the capability curve caught them off guard.
Interesting. And that kind of like brings me to our next interesting point that, we've been like discussing as well. And then obviously there was this like really interesting piece that I saw today where Jory at 2022, sorry, 22V Research is now kind of predicting a cyber attack on major bank within 12 months, severe enough to drop global markets 10% in a single day, which is super concerning, and it calls
Yeah.
kind of like a near certainty on this matter. And his argument is basically that model capabilities have gotten like too good for most enterprise defenses, and the velocity of AI enabled attacks is kind of like outrunning security responses that enterprises have currently, and attackers hold the same tools as defenders, which none of the overhead kind of like, and it's kind of a scenario he sketches is worth hearing precisely. And I
Yeah.
think this is very timely that ECB has acted on it, and they've asked for a plan and they're kind of preparing for it because banks are probably going to be the most targeted enterprises if this kind of gets to the point where people are predicting it. So interesting to watch this as well. What do you think?
Yeah, I believe that it's It's very on time that people are starting to paying attention, especially in EU, because we usually kind of tend to be late to the party. And notably, like defensive side of this industry agrees that the threat, even where it differs on the odds, because in the same chat, Nikesh Arora at Palo Alto Networks, he has been making the same case for months that the AI threat surface is larger and faster moving than anything in prior eras. So, which is actually his argument for why platform consolidation is the only viable response. So, the person selling the defenses and the person analyzing the tail risk describe the same vector, and the disagreement is only about whether current defenses are already close to adequate. And to your point, and the story that you saw in Vesser's view is that they aren't, because in his conclusion is that we see that the tail risk simply isn't priced into markets just yet.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think we should be careful here because a near certainty claim about timing is kind of like a strong call, and such predictions, these predictions kind of like have a way of being right about the mechanism, but
Of
wrong
course.
about the date or the timing. So yeah, it's going to
We,
be
yeah.
interesting.
And actually, this connects us to the deeper threat we've been pulling for weeks now, because the risk board went beyond cyber defenses and explicitly warned that the concentration of leading AI providers outside of the European Union leaves the bloc exposed to strategic dependencies and geopolitical risks. So, calling for coordinated action to strengthen Europe's own capabilities is into action right now. And the same models can be your best defensive tool and your biggest exposure all at once. And it all depends on who's controlling the access to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know what you're seeing in the market about the response to this ECB story. However, this is like kind of very new, and we'll continue to see what's developing there. But I remember Mistral is, I kind of like read this report. They're reportedly in discussions with European banks as well about deploying its own product to uncover security flaws. And that's the sovereignty play happening in real time for sure in Europe, because it's a European model, obviously sold to European banks for a job that American model kind of proved both essential but revocable, right? So whether Mistral can match Mythos, which was a model specifically mentioned in the ECB letter on capabilities, is a question to watch, obviously. But the commercial door only opened because trust in the previous models has kind of like wobbled, I would say.
Yeah, we'll see how this whole story unfolds. But I think the takeaway for anyone watching, either from a bank, a fintech, or any regulated company in either Europe or Asia, AI risk is real and it's here, because when a regulator wants yours in a few months and analysts are openly modeling a 10% single day drawdown, the question of which models you depend on and what your fallback looks like becomes crazily important for them.
Absolutely. It's definitely interesting what's unfolding in Europe. And
Ah,
yeah,
crazy. Yeah.
that kind of brings us to our favorite topic on open source models.
Ooh,
And
favorite one. Yes, indeed. Stuff is happening in Asia as well, and very, very. I think it's a massive change there, but I think that the authorities are handling it quite adequately and trying to catch up with what AI is in the AI race that is currently going on worldwide. So I believe the next story is quite interesting. Thank you for putting that up. Jesse Zhang, CEO of Decagon, the customer service AI company, published something this week that flips a narrative we've repeated on this show. The capability gap between open and closed models is down to low single digits. Chinese labs ship frontier adjacent open weights every few weeks, and Meituan just dropped 1.6 trillion parameter model under an MIT license. And companies like Decagon run about 90% of their workloads on open source. And yet, open source just fell to 11% of enterprise LLM spend, down from 19 just 1 year ago. And yeah, the
Yeah, I think what
open
I'm
model
getting from
doubled.
this is,
Sorry, yeah.
yeah, that's interesting, some of the data that you pointed out. And yeah, I was saying that what I'm reading from this is like open models are getting better for sure, and their share of spend is shrinking, right? Which sounds impossible if you think about it until you hear his explanation, which is super interesting, right? Which is why we're discussing this in the first place. So he can explain that when a use case is new, you reach for the smallest, you reach for the smartest general model available, right? Because you don't know the shape of the problem yet. So you happily kind of pay the frontier premium, if you will.
Yeah.
And once the use case is kind of fully understood to you, once you know the inputs and the behaviors and the failure modes that you kind of like come across in that, the trade flips, you want the smallest, fastest model fine tuned to do your one thing extremely well. Small plus fine tune basically means kind of like open weights. So I think that's what he means, why the open source is shrinking. But you kind of like disclosed some numbers around how they're how they sit kind of like at a 90% open source spend.
Yeah.
You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, because it's interesting because 90% open source is and actually this has been like one of the most mature AI use cases because of Decagon is an AI customer service company. So we are talking about huge volume and well understood workflows because this was actually one of the first use cases for AI. And the enterprise average sits at 11% because thousands of brand new use cases are actually spun out every week now, and especially this year. And these new use cases start life on frontier models rather than old ones. So the falling share is a denominator effect. Immature projects are multiplying faster than mature ones. But I guess it's very important that you try and fail fast, fail as quickly as possible, and also try different things on the latest models because those have been improved times and times again over the past ones and what has been hyped like a year ago. And yeah, it's crazy that this is okay. I'll stop
Yeah,
here and give it to you.
it's interesting because this kind of like leads to what he's trying to tell you in terms of like a forecast. So every use case is being prototyped in a closed frontier model right today.
Yeah,
It's kind of and it is kind of like a future open source migration that's going to happen, which is what he kind of mentioned. So the labs keep owning discovery while source models gradually own production, because of that entire cycle of like initially when you're not sure of what you really need as an output, and you're not sure about even inputs and variables, you can try and test the better model, which has premium, because you're sure that it will give you those variables and that clarity. And I mean, he did say that's going to take years. It's not like it's going to happen tomorrow. You kind of you kind of experiment on the frontier models and then kind of move the production right away. Since fine tuning, takes a lot of expertise and a lot of effort, right? And there needs to be a team focused on that. And if a use case is super valuable for a company, then they might not even move to production, right? Because if it's, like I said, if it's super valuable. But if you're building in Asia or Europe, the sequence is basically a roadmap or a thesis that you could kind of keep in mind. Prototype on the frontier model, pay the premium, because you don't have to pay it once you move to production, and then
yeah.
graduate to open source models. You control once the shape of your product kind of like settles down and is clearer. So I feel this was a very, very good unpacking on the entire open source debate and the thesis that we've been talking about.
For sure.
All right, so I think we're kind of like done with the most interesting deep dives that we wanted to. But I also want to like cover some of the interesting, you know, news flashes that we've been seeing this week. So why don't you pick up the first one?
Yeah, I think there are two quick ones before we go. Microsoft put $2.5 billion and around 6,000 engineers into a new frontier company whose entire job is embedding inside customers to make their AI actually work. And days after, that's just days after Amazon put 1 billion into its own version of it. So we did a whole segment on forward deployed engineers in episode 1, and this is that thesis going in the at industrial scale. The quiet admission that the models are ready, and most organizations aren't. So someone has to physically go sit with those models and put them to use. And according to each company, it's going to look different.
Absolutely. I think this is a big one. And also something super interesting that has come up today is a lot of like um, Chinese companies, ByteDance's Doubao, Alibaba's Quen, and Tencent's Yonbao are shutting down features that let users create custom AI companions with actually ByteDance closing July 15th, as soon as July 15th. It kind of comes up ahead of like new Chinese regulations and human like AI services take effect in mid-July, because it's kind of like we're booming in China, right? And these
Yeah.
rules are driven by the cyberspace administration there, prohibiting content that triggers extreme emotions in minors or fosters kind of unhealthy emotional dependencies, right? Which is already kind of like at its peak with social media and all of that. And we know the story there. And yeah, and I guess it's a good call that they're curbing this with AI, because it's only going to get like it's going to only explode on top of social media what we have. And it's also kind of like a bar providers from training future models on sensitive conversation data as well. So that's another interesting thing. Because I remember when we spoke about open source models, and why some would call it dangerous. This is one of the reasons, because you could really, really replicate some of the dangerous use cases on top of it, and there is no way to stop them. So having regulations around this is a big way to kind of tackle that. And the crackdown kind of mirrors growing global concerns over AI companionship as well, with um, you know platforms like character.ai facing lawsuits, as we
Yeah.
know, work on emotional dependency. And yeah, China's taking the right step, at least in this direction.
I'm impressed by how fast they actually react to what's been going on in the AI space, and it's just like, to be honest, even US cannot catch up with these regulations as fast as China. But kudos to that cyberspace administration, I guess. And I believe one more story that we skipped, but I think it's important to go through it. Anthropic shipped spent caps and model level controls for Claude Enterprise, right after companies like Uber burned a year's AI budget in 4 months. So sensible plumbing on the surface, but notice what the DIO actually does. Because when an admin routes a team to the cheaper model to protect the budget, they're also quietly setting a ceiling on that team's output quality. And nobody downstream sees the DIO move. So we're thinking about, if you run procurement or any business like that. But I think it's also important to mention that what Anthropic is doing as well.
Yeah, and that reminds me that next week we're having an interesting founding engineer talk about a lot of like these workflows and how they can be managed. But for today, that's all, and that was the week with all the major updates. And like I said, on Thursday we'd be talking some interesting AI workflows and how some of the engineers out there are kind of like building great products around it. and some of the messiest problems they're trying to solve, because those are the hard ones,
Absolutely.
complicated business operations, whether it's supply chain, procurement, like you said, where it's kind of hard to build, and we have someone who's going to come and unpack this for us. So yeah, that was for today, and see you on Thursday.